Welcome to Meet the Disruptors, 2 days of free online events exploring key market challenges brought to you by Ditto, the B2B tech marketing practice. Thank you for joining our panel discussion, CWSI in Action with AIB. Today we'll be discussing remote working, cybersecurity, risk and productivity, and adapting to the changing world. We'll hear how CWSI and AIB have worked together over the years, from the first adoption of the iPhone for business to redesigning workflows and networks in response to COVID and the increase in remote working. We've also got a mixture of slides and animation today to take us on our journey. So first, some introductions. I'm Mike Richardson, COO of Ditto, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's session. I'm joined this morning by Paul Connerty, Principal Consultant at CWSI, and David Kyle, Security Strategy and Architecture Manager at AIB. Just a little on me. I've had over 10 years experience in digital marketing, specializing in content, SEO, paid media, and social media. I've been with Ditto for 2 years, focusing on insurance and insurtech and developing content for clients, including webinars, white papers, case studies, podcasts, and video. I'm also an associate of the Chartered Institute of Marketing. So if I hand over to Paul, please could you introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Mike. So I'm Paul Connerty. I've about 20 years plus experience in the technology sector, primarily in IT and security roles. Did a lot of work in telco. I've been with CWSI for 6 years now. Would have started out in the professional services part of the business, but then moved into leading the build out of our consulting practice. I suppose I specialize in strategy and security advice around modern workforces and really getting the most out of mobile technologies and flexible working. And I also work with David, actually, here in a second, with the Irish Information Security Forum Committee as well.
Brilliant. And David, if you could please introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm David Cahill, Security Strategy and Architecture Manager in AIB. So I'm 16 years or so in the InfoSec space across financial services. So I started off with EBS Building Society and then latterly with AIB. I've been heavily involved in a number of security architecture and strategy deployments across the bank, including most recently mobility and collaboration activities, hence the topics we're discussing today. Also, I've been involved in good stuff like identity and access management, network segmentation, EDR, cloud services adoption. So I guess just in terms of specializations, really, I'm advising on best practices for designing corporate security policies, so be they enterprise mobility management, like Paul referenced there, or security awareness. And I'm also a committee member of the Irish Information Security Forum. We're a non-for-profit group which was set up to improve the understanding and practice of information security across the business computer user community in Ireland.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul and David. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be moderating today, and thank you for taking part in today's discussion and sharing your insights. A note to the audience, this webinar is being recorded, and you can enter your questions, any questions you have, in the chat in the GoToWebinar side panel. We'll be stopping this session as close to 12:40 as possible, at which point we encourage you all to take part in the digital hangout taking place at ditto.tv MTD/MTD. So if you fire up your browser window when that happens, we'll all move over there. To start this morning, I'll give a short overview of the topic. We'll discuss transformation of mobility. We'll be looking at the challenges firms are currently dealing with when redesigning workflows for off-site working, and we'll discuss planning for the new state of remote connectivity and sort of future-proofing. There'll be time at the end for audience questions, as I've said, so if you have any, please submit them into the question form provided by GoToWebinar, and the panel will then sum up with one closing comment each, and we'll move to the digital hangout for further questions, should we not have time to get to them at the end. So just a short overview of our topic today. For many companies, an extended period of working from home will be a huge test of their enterprise mobility workflow. They'll have to rapidly develop solutions to software distribution, policy management, inventory management, security management, and service management for smartphones, laptops, and media tablets. How many of their employees already use a mobile device to get their work done? How will they manage the increased security risk of a dispersed, globally connected workforce? And now that dust is supposedly settling, what role does enterprise mobility play in their digital transformation and the future of work? Today, with Paul and David, we'll look at how CWSI and AIB have worked together to redesign workflows for enterprise mobility, whilst also reacting to the current global climate and planning for the future. So let's start section 1, an introduction to enterprise mobility. And I believe, Jonathan, we've got a short video to sort of tee us up for this conversation. Fantastic. So that's a great way of teeing us up for this conversation. So turning to Paul and David, could you each talk us through the enterprise mobility journey with CWSI and AIB? And we'll start with Paul.
Sure. So I think AIB were one of the earlier customers with CWSI. They actually predated me joining the company. So I think we've a relationship going back to 2012, which in the mobile world is ancient history. And again, like most firms of their time, they kind of started out with a requirement to move to enable a post BlackBerry space. So they started seeing what you might call executive jewelry, or high people in the organization looking to enable iPhones in particular initially to get access to email as an alternative to BlackBerries. And obviously these consumer devices didn't come with the kind of same very mature controls that you would have had with BlackBerry, which would have been out at that point over 10 years or 11 years. So this challenge of managing those devices, AIB had to look around, and EBS probably at the time as well, for someone to help them with, and that's where CWSI came to the table. So I think the initial engagement was primarily around introducing mobile device management, which was Mobile Iron, and that was used to manage those small numbers of devices, but they very quickly grew. And I think there's now an estate of over 5,000 iPhones and iPads in AIB. With all sorts of use cases in terms of back office workers, but also some retail applications and using iPads, and also in AIB's Innovation Hub in Dundrum. And I think AIB would have been a very classic CWSI client. We have a lot of clients in this space in highly regulated, high security requirements, where they have to maintain very strong security controls. But also AIB would be an organization that definitely want to innovate, but they want to do that in a prudent way, so they can leverage the capabilities of these new operating systems, these new devices, but at the same time do that cautiously and while still ensuring they meet all the requirements they have as a highly regulated pillar bank in Ireland.
And David? Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. So to echo what you were saying there, really, like we started, like most organizations, as a BlackBerry house, and very much generation 1, email only, isolated from all our other internal systems apart from mail. And then, as you said, really it was what initially drove the adoption of smart devices was that kind of exec corporate jewelry, which I know was consistent with a lot of other organizations at the time. And this led to the initial adoption of smart devices, so specifically iOS. So if an exec wanted their iPhone or their iPad to be able to display corporate content, well, then we had to come up with a way of enabling that, but enabling it in a secure manner. And that's where CWSI came on board and helped us with that. And it wasn't just a case of kind of shoehorning in a solution. It was really about coming up and defining what our target state was first. So, what were we looking to do, defining that, documenting it, coming up with our security policies, which we're going to wrap around that, and then also our technical configuration standards, or the specific configurations that we could put in place to make sure that we were satisfied from a security perspective. And really from there, like once we went ahead and implemented the MDM tooling and got those iOS devices deployed, we then looked at how we could push the envelope a bit and look at how we could enable more advanced use cases. So as Paul referred to there, we have an innovation hub located out in Dundrum Town Centre, and we looked at doing some pretty cool stuff there in terms of kind of online account opening, whereby you could take tablet devices and actually travel through the entire account opening process via a tablet device, rather than having to go through the traditional bricks and mortar into the branch, get all your paperwork, take it home, send it back in. So it was a much more streamlined process, digitally enabled process. But also what we found was, in terms of use cases, then this became a lot more attractive to kind of emerging customer segments or market segments as such. So for example, if you look at a third level institution or colleges, those kind of users are much more adept and much more interested in technology enabled processes and technology enabled offerings, and that's where these online services specifically enabled through smart devices came in useful. And today, I guess what we're doing is we're going beyond that again, and we're leveraging through MAM, or mobile application management, and specifically focusing on collaboration and integrating with our internal productivity applications as well.
Great. And we touched on it a little bit there, and I particularly like the phrase corporate jewelry as a way of people getting invested in these devices to start off with. And we kind of have covered the business need for implementing enterprise mobility. But can you talk us through how attitudes to mobile working have changed over time, from sort of the introduction of the BlackBerry, then adopting the first iPhone in 2007 to today? And I'll start with Paul.
Yeah, so I'm actually, for my sins, I was an early BlackBerry admin back when BlackBerry first came on board, and prior to that I would have been involved in setting up things like Palm Pilots, which I'm sure there's people in the audience have never even heard of, which was one of the older first mobile devices, and HP Jornadas that enable you to get access to email. But when the likes of the iPhone and that came along, initially I think the overwhelming response from the IT and security professionals was, we don't want them, they're not enterprise grade devices, they're consumer grade devices. And initially, in some cases, we were being brought in to help explain to the business why they weren't safe. So some of the early work that Philip Harrison would have done at our CTO would have been around, businesses asking him, give me all the security problems there is with the iPhone. But very quickly, the NDMs came along and started to change that view. And so I think, in simple terms, things have gone from those devices are not good enough for enterprise to these devices are critical to our business, because mobile devices and smart devices have become critical to business and to how everybody do things. And one of the key drivers of that has been the ability, and probably the underlying key characteristic of mobile devices, mobile operating systems, is rapid change and rapid iteration and rapid improvement. So enterprise software tends to move quite slowly, but from those initial iPhone devices, which had very little management and no encryption, to a couple of years later to Apple and Android having fully enterprise grade management controls, to where we are now with integrations across the authentication stack with SSO, support for certificates and all various levels of encryption, and very deep integration with cloud services and enterprise services. Mobile technology has shown how it has grown up far faster than maybe any other technology that I've ever seen in the enterprise space. So I think that a lot of those IT and security concerns were allayed very, very quickly. It did still take quite some time before that confidence level grew in organizations, especially in organizations that were highly regulated or had very low risk tolerance. But I think that's all completely changed now, and most organizations now, it's a case of we must support mobile devices, we must support potentially BYOD or personal devices, and we must be able to leverage these technologies because that's the expectation their consumers have, and that's the expectation that the staff that they're hiring have. And organizations that don't embrace these technologies are finding it more difficult to attract and retain talent. So I think there was a very good quote from AIB's CIO, and I'll paraphrase it slightly. Tim Hines challenged his own IT team and ourselves as one of the vendors with is that the bank wanted to be able to deliver any service on any device anywhere. And I think that is something that we're hearing across the board in organizations, and that's what CIOs and CTOs are really looking to do.
Brilliant. And I mean, so David, is it the same from your point of view, from AIB's point of view, the attitude's changing to mobile working?
Yeah, so as Paul alluded to there, I mean, with the move from kind of fully corporate devices to consumer smart devices, what we saw was that real enablement, because you were going from, having single-use devices, whereas end users would put the device down at the end of the day, to having this dual persona whereby you can have smart devices that have their corporate partition as such and yet still be used as a personal device. I mean, users are not only do they embrace those devices and kind of come to expect them, as Paul said, it was really in terms of the productivity and user acceptance went right through the roof. And so initially we went from the kind of the tablets and the smartphones to nowadays right up to the laptops, which are controlled by Enterprise Mobility Suite, but they're also agnostic of the device type. So whether it's iOS, whether it's a Microsoft Surface Pro, or so on and so forth. And I guess in terms to the attitude towards mobile working, on top of the security piece and the risk tolerance that Paul alluded to there, I mean, they were certainly fundamental concerns to the bank, and they continue to be. But once they were allayed in terms of the options available to us and the standards that we could adhere to, there was also kind of a behavioral or an attitude thing, I think, as well, that you'd find in kind of your more traditional enterprises, whereby there had been, from a legacy perspective, this perception that people were less productive when they were operating in a mobile environment, whereas now it's really fully accepted, and not only is it seen as on a par, but actually people, depending on their circumstances, can be more productive and get more done based on a kind of a mobile perspective. And then also to touch on Paul's point around expectation, that if you're looking at prospective employees, whether they're coming out of third level or they're coming out of another organization, there is this expectation that they're going to be enabled in a remote manner, and that they're going to have access to collaborative tooling and smart devices. And if you don't have that, well, then you're not going to keep up with the competition. So it's just it's another influencing factor. And I guess the only other point I'd touch on is that even before the COVID situation that we find ourselves in now, AIB were encouraging their staff to spend up to 2 days a week working remotely. So I guess that shift had started to happen even before the situation we find ourselves in now.
Brilliant. The appetite in banking for mobility solutions has skyrocketed in the current climate. And I think we've touched on these a bit before in the last two questions, but why were banks and other highly regulated firms so cautious to adopt mobility solutions in the past? And I'll start with David.
Yeah, well, we were, relatively speaking, we were in EBS and subsequently AIB, we were quite early adopters, and that was as a result of the CWSI relationship. I mean, they were able to give us confidence that the mobile solutions could be delivered in a secure manner, and what I mean by that is actually secure by design. So as opposed to the age-old approach to security, or legacy approach in terms of retrofitting security controls, what we did was I alluded to earlier, but we sat down and we defined our target state or our target architecture, and we built in those security controls from the start, making sure that we were in compliance with both our security policies, but also our regulatory mandates. But in regards to financial services and really highly regulated entities across the board, I guess that caution is fully understandable. I mean, we're held to account in terms of regulatory requirements, whether it's GDPR in Europe, whether it's financial conduct authority in the UK, whether it's the US Fed in the States. Like there's so many compliance mandates out there, and then the consequences of not complying with them, whether, you know, obviously you've got the security risk itself, but you've also got, you know, potential data breaches as well, which can result in, you know, heavy sanctions or fines, or even kind of a brand impact, which could be ultimately worse than any fine in terms of adoption of your service or that consumer trust piece. So yeah, I fully understand why historically there has been that concern, but I think what we have seen in terms of recent times is that once that assurance is there in terms of the security capabilities, and you build them in from the start, that you're seeing more and more organizations adopt.
And Paul, did you have any sort of extra thoughts on cautious adopters from a
Well,
mobility?
I think the key word that David mentioned there for me is, with two hats on really, but primarily with my consumer, as a consumer of financial services, is trust. So I think banking in particular is a pillar of the economy and of people's lives. And if you can't trust an institution to handle your money and to handle your transactions and do that in a very robust way, you're not going to want to do business with them. So I think banking in particular needs to be absolutely sure that the technology is done properly. And as David mentioned there several times, what's absolutely key is security by design and not an afterthought. So I think that does lead itself to maybe a slightly slower adoption rate of new technology, but it's for a very good reason. And I think while we do see some excellent innovation now and some challengers with the likes of, you know, some of the challenger banks like N26 and Revolut challenging the more traditional banking, those challengers don't necessarily have the legacy overheads of the technology and the compliance layers that some of the main banks had. That's some of the reasons why people might have not have seen some of these services coming online as quickly, but that gap is closing rapidly. And I would expect that, you know, digital services, digital banking, again, accelerated in a way by COVID, but you know what I've seen, the changes that you're capable of doing now is massive, and it's only going to increase even further over the next 6 months to a year. Because again, as I said earlier, mobile just iterates so rapidly. Change can happen really quickly.
Brilliant, and I think we're going to touch on that a bit in our sort of next section. So if we go to our second video of the session, looking at redesigning legacy workflows for off-site working. Brilliant. So turning to Paul first, I think with this, can you explain how previous networks and workflows have been disrupted?
Yeah, so recent events, it doesn't seem that recent now. I feel like we've been in this transition or this new world for quite a long time now, even though it's only probably been about 3 months. But I think what we've seen is an acceleration more than depending on the organization. So for some organizations, it's just been, you know, an acceleration or consolidation of their digital transformation that they're already going through, and then for others, it has been a massive disruption and a complete tactical shift from how they used to do business to how they've had to do business to survive in the last three months or so. I think if I was to look at AIB's case, as you probably David has covered earlier and we've spoken about earlier, AIB were already fairly well down the road of enabling their staff to work flexibly, and they had already got, you know, people working from home, and they had the tools and technologies in place to do so. So I think in their case, their workflows and ways of working obviously were impacted, but might not have been impacted as much as some. But then we see other areas like my old places of work, which was telcos, where they've had to take call centers and digitize those and have people using soft phones on laptops working from home, where previously they all had been, you know, in a desk environment in a large space. We're seeing events like this one, you know, which probably would have been in person in a nice hotel somewhere in Dublin, being done online, but being done really, really well in terms of how people are now starting to collaborate using, you know, breakout rooms and webinar tools. Even very large events like Apple's WWDC and Comic-Con are moving online. It's changing the entire landscape of how things are being done, even down to small local businesses. I know that locally, you know, even services like the local garden centre and stuff like that, offering, you know, click and collect and all sorts of innovative elements around using things like Facebook and other platforms to be able to sell their products. I think any organization that doesn't have a digital channel to interact with its customers now is in serious trouble. So that's all kind of been accelerated. I think a lot of companies were on that journey before, but this whole COVID situation has massively, you know, changed things overnight. I suppose that's the main. I think that we've seen disruption across every single organization, not just banking, professional services. It's across the board.
Sure. I mean, David, do you have any sort of, you could probably agree with a lot of Paul's points there. Do you have anything additional on sort of disruption to the previous networks?
Yeah, so what I would say is that not necessarily any disruption, but what I would say is that the consideration for good stuff like modern authentication would have changed. So, for example, for our on-premise channels moving to the cloud, closing off basic authentication while users are accessing resources externally. So, for example, you know, having different trust models based on the location of the users. So whereas historically everybody would have been in the office and might have the same level of trust, when you have people working remotely, that's not necessarily going to be the same case. So you just need to adapt to that. So I guess effectively what we've done is we've moved the security perimeter to the user and the device, instead of locating it purely at your traditional firewall or DMZ or network perimeter. And really, this has come with a mind shift in the way we allow access to our resources.
We're now, I mean, speaking of COVID, we're now in a place where we can reflect on how firms responded to COVID, you know, assessing the impact on a day-to-day operations. How effective were firms, in your opinion, in adapting to changes in workflows, and what lessons can be learned from that response? And I'll start with David this time.
Yeah, I'd say the most important part of AIB's response was to make sure that things were not over-engineered while enabling people to access resources. So while they're in a remote working environment, we've had to adapt quickly to a different way of thinking. But as long as we maintain security at front of mind and we're not over-complicating the end solution, I believe that AIB and other firms really are able to do this in a secure and structured way. So really what we've been trying to do is avoid tactical solutions and coming up with enterprise-ready solutions that can be enabled in a structured basis across the organization. Because if you go enabling tactical solutions, yeah, they might fix problems in the short term, but then you have to go back and retrofit and bring them back on board with the enterprise solution. So I really think for the minimum short-term game, it's not worth the long-term pain as such. I would have some concerns generally about companies reacting to the new way of working that we find ourselves during COVID-19 and not really considering what happens when we all move back to working in an office environment, if and when that ever is. But really what organizations need to be cognizant of is the strain that some of the new technology that they've put in place during the remote working environments that we're in now, what that strain will put on our existing infrastructure and data centers and good stuff like that.
And Paul, just your thoughts on sort of how effective firms were in adapting.
Yeah, so I think it's the jury's still out a little bit, but based on what firms that I've been working with and organizations that I've been working with, I think the majority of them have handled this quite well. I think in particular areas like finance, professional services, legal, those kind of areas have managed to handle things very, very well. And overall, there's no massive evidence that productivity has taken any kind of a hit. And in fact, it has opened up all sorts of interesting discussions about, better life balance and making flexible working a more attractive and more realistic opportunity in businesses. I would caveat that, the space that I work in primarily were much more resilient to something like this and would have been much more mature in things like business continuity planning and adopting mobile technologies and having the kind of maturity to deal with these kind of business impacting events. I think if you were to look at areas like hospitality and retail and those kind of areas, they're obviously in a different kind of space, and that some of them may not be able to leverage technology to help them, or may not have been in a position to do so due to lack of resources or lack of knowledge. I think a lot of what was done was also down to an incredible amount of hard work to IT teams out there. I think speaking to my peers who still work in the kind of IT delivery space, there was an incredible amount of rolling out hundreds and thousands of laptops in 24, 48, 72 hours, massively upscaling, virtual networks and virtual storage and virtual desktop technologies and firewalls and VPNs. It was just an incredible amount of hard work done very, very quickly to enable businesses to keep going, which I think is just very impressive, but is also a slight worry. Because for me, if I think about the lessons learned, organizations need to plan for these kind of global events better. I think there was definitely good planning in most organizations for location specific type issues like earthquakes or hurricanes or storms or civil unrest in one specific part of the world or one specific region. But massive global events like what COVID is, and this could be the start of all different kinds of pandemics. There's been warnings about this stuff for quite some time, and then we've got obviously the medium-term issues around climate change and other areas, and then quite a lot of civil unrest in the world. I think businesses need to be thinking that this kind of business continuity planning needs to be much more invested in, and that we need to have a much more resilient business model, and that will require maybe rethinking the strategy of where they locate their headquarters, where they keep their staff, and how they enable them. So I think that there's going to be much more strategic planning around how to do that. And also, I think there is some reflection time needed now to look at all that tactical, reactive hard work that was done, and review it and see, did we introduce any additional risk into the business? Was there any controls that were weakened, or is the compliance and oversight layer that would normally be there still able to perform in a remote environment? Is it still able to perform to the same degree? So there's definitely, I think, a period of reflection now that needs to be done, and kind of a lift the head up and looking out strategically to plan for how we deal with this, and not just how things have changed now, but how we could deal with events like this in the future, so that businesses can kind of bounce back and be more elastic and less brittle.
Fantastic. Now, I'm conscious we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left, so I'd like to move on to the sort of concluding section and look at some real-world mobility use cases from AIB and CWSI that you've actually implemented. So first, let's look at a short video on future-proofing and planning for the new state of remote connectivity. Fantastic. So handing over to you, Paul, can you explain what device agnostic productivity is and the impact?
Sure. Well, I think that the easiest way to think about this is productivity is enabled by people. So people are the engines of productivity. Tooling and access and processes are all are all tools, but the real productivity comes from people. And device agnostic productivity is about enabling people to be productive regardless of the channel that they're using. So access to data, a device really is just a window. It's just a method of accessing data and to enable someone to perform some piece of work. So I think what business have traditionally had to do is work was a place you went to and a device you used to access a system. Whereas now it's an outcome, and people need to think about what's the best way to achieve those outcomes and how do I enable people to do that. And that could be through mobile devices, that could be through cloud services. But ultimately, it's about enabling the person to do it in the most efficient and easy way possible. So user experience has become incredibly important. So I think device agnostic productivity is all about the user being able to do their job on the tool that is most suited to the context of where they're working and what they're doing.
Brilliant. And just to jump ahead a bit with you, David, can you just talk us through unified endpoint management and why it's crucial for enterprise mobility management? You know, what infrastructure do firms need to invest in moving forward?
Yeah, so unified endpoint management is really about being able to manage and utilize devices regardless of the device type, so that you have a consistent configuration and consistent management across the estate. I guess it's critical that you choose the correct unified endpoint management platform, but to cater specifically for your business and security requirements. So it's not necessarily a one size fits all. So specifically having something that caters for the platforms or operating systems that you have in your environment and the use cases of utmost importance to you or your customers. I guess that's going to give you the ability to have a single pane of glass. I know it's a cliched phrase, but we might get there one day. A single pane of glass view across the entire organization, and really a single location for your configuration policies, your compliance requirements, and your security baselines, and therefore a single way into the organization and onto our productivity suite while users are working regardless of their location.
That's fantastic. Thank you, David. I've got lots more questions on productivity, and there's a few other use cases, but I'm going to save them for the digital hangout in a moment. I've really enjoyed this session, so thank you both. To round off, I'd like to have one closing comment from Paul and David. So if there's one thing you'd like the audience to take away from today's discussion, what would that be? And can I start with Paul?
Sure. Well, I think the key for me is what I mentioned already about what we should do now is have a period of reflection and review. So I think there's three key things that I think people need to look at, which is basically to review what they've done over the last 3 months and see if they've introduced any new risks during the tactical rollout of their devices and their access to services, how well the management configuration that they've put in place is delivering on both the security side, but also very much so on the user experience side. Are they making remote working or flexible working an enjoyable and productive experience? And really, how can they sustain this flexible working model and improve on it, just to make organizations become that much more flexible and resilient? I like to think about this like the zero trust piece. Around the old networks were about castles and firewalls and building around a safe space. Whereas with zero trust, you're talking about all the security needs to be all the way down to the person, who they are, their identity, and to the device. And I think the same thing needs to be said about flexible working. So, you don't want to have all your security in your main building. You want to be able to trust the user to be able to work from anywhere and do their job in the same way. So those are the kind of key thoughts I'd like to leave everyone with.
And David, a key thought from you for our audience?
Yeah, I've touched on a couple of these before, but I guess one for me, and Paul has mentioned it there, will be around just taking stock and making sure that the environment that you find yourself operating in at the moment is still fit for purpose in terms of a security and a compliance perspective. So that could be something as simple as getting, you know, a configuration, security configuration review done, something like the good folks at CWSI can help you with, but also making sure that you've actually enabled your tools to deliver on, you know, ultimately what's your business requirement here, because at the end of the day, it's all about delivering successful outcomes for our customers, regardless of what industry you find yourself working in.
Fantastic. So again, many thanks to you both, Paul and David, for sharing your thoughts and your insights. To find out more about CWSI, for a copy of today's slides, or to discuss any of the topics covered, please get in touch on info@cwsi.co.uk or visit cwsisecurity.com. This session has been recorded and a link to that video will be shared via email. Please visit now ditto.tv/MTD straight after this webinar ends for the digital hangout with our panel, our moderators, and other audience members. On screen now, you'll see the other events we have happening throughout the day. Until then, just to say thank you very much for attending, and we will see you over in the digital hangout.